The afternoon, a stranger invited me aboard the fishing boat my daughter insisted she had sold months earlier. I assumed he had mistaken me for someone else. Then he smiled, unlocked the cabin door, and said something that stopped me where I stood. "Laura told me not to move a single hook, chart, or coffee mug until you came back." I stepped aboard. Everything looked exactly as I had left it. The same weathered compass above the helm. The same faded Coast Guard coffee cup balanced beside the throttle. Even my late wife's blue windbreaker still hung from the cabin hook where she always left it after our final fishing trip together. If the boat had truly been sold, why did it still feel like it was quietly waiting for me? If you've ever wondered whether someone you love hid the truth to protect something greater than either of you, stay with me. For several minutes I simply stood inside the cabin without speaking. Salt air drifted through the open hatch. The engine carried the familiar scent of clean diesel and fresh oil. Nothing suggested new ownership. Nothing suggested goodbye. During 31 years supervising Coast Guard search and rescue operations, I learned something that saved more lives than any rescue equipment ever could. Small details told the truth long before people were ready to speak it. I slowly ran my hand across the wooden chart table. My initials remained carved beneath the edge where no visitor would ever notice them. The stranger watched quietly. "I'm Daniel Brooks, the Marina harbor master. I've been hoping you'd stop by." "You know who I am?" He nodded. "Laura told me stories about this boat long before the paperwork was signed." Paperwork, not purchase. His choice of words settled quietly in my thoughts. I looked toward the framed photograph still resting above the bunk. It showed my wife, Margaret, smiling beside the day's catch during our 25th wedding anniversary. The frame hadn't moved even half an inch. No one changed anything. Daniel smiled gently. "Those were my instructions." "Whose instructions?" "Your daughter's." Technically complete, emotionally unfinished. Instead of asking another question, I quietly stepped back onto the dock. Confronting Laura without understanding the evidence would accomplish nothing. Observation came first. Conclusions came later. Daniel reached into the cabin and removed a worn, blue maintenance binder. "I think this belongs with you." Inside rested engine service records stretching back almost 15 years. Every repair, every fuel system inspection, every seasonal maintenance visit. The entries continued, even after the date Laura supposedly sold the boat. I slowly turned another page. 3 months after the sale, someone had replaced the propeller shaft bearings. 2 months later, fresh navigation lights had been installed. Last month, the hull received a complete preservation treatment. Someone continued investing thousands of dollars into a boat that no longer belonged to my family. I quietly closed the binder. The sale suddenly made less sense than ever. As I thanked Daniel and walked toward the marina office, one final detail caught my attention. The vessel's harbor permit displayed inside the office window still carried the same handwritten name I had painted across the stern nearly 20 years earlier. Margaret's Promise. No one had changed that either. I carried the blue maintenance binder home without opening it again. Some questions deserved patience. During 31 years supervising Coast Guard search and rescue missions, I learned another lesson that mattered just as much as knowing where to search. When every visible fact pointed in one direction, the missing document usually pointed somewhere else. That evening, Laura stopped by carrying fresh clam chowder from the harbor cafe my wife had loved. "You've been at the marina." It wasn't a question. I smiled. "I took a walk." She looked toward the maintenance binder resting on the kitchen table. Daniel had already called her. That much became obvious. "I didn't want you finding out that way." "Finding out what?" "The boat is being well cared for." Technically true, emotionally incomplete. I nodded slowly. "It certainly is." She visibly relaxed. "I know this has been difficult." Difficult doesn't always mean wrong. For just a moment she looked as though she wanted to explain everything. Instead, she quietly changed the subject. "We're having dinner Sunday." "I'd love for you to come." Another technically honest answer hiding a much larger truth. After she left, I finally opened the maintenance binder. Every service invoice had been filed with remarkable precision. Engine inspections, hull cleanings, safety equipment replacements, navigation electronics. The payments never came from the new owner's name. Instead, they all listed the same account. Harbor Heritage Stewardship Program. Stewardship, not ownership. The wording immediately caught my attention. The next morning, I returned to the marina. Rather than questioning Daniel directly, I walked through the public harbor office, reviewing vessel registration notices posted on the information board. My old fishing boat appeared exactly where I expected, except one line no longer matched my memory. Owner, Harbor Heritage Stewardship Trust. Not Daniel Brooks, not Laura Sullivan, not Peter Sullivan. A trust. Another contradiction. Daniel quietly appeared beside me carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I figured you'd eventually notice that." "I notice paperwork before people," he laughed. "Laura said you would." I accepted the coffee. "I'm not asking questions today." "No?" "No." Strategic silence often revealed more than argument. Daniel leaned against the dock railing. "That's probably wise." Another incomplete answer. Instead of pressing further, I wandered toward the maintenance workshop, where I had serviced the boat for nearly 20 years. Frank Miller still ran the place. He recognized me immediately. "Peter, I was wondering when you'd come." "You've seen the boat?" "I have." He reached beneath the counter and placed several recent maintenance receipts in front of me. "I thought these belonged together." Each receipt carried photographs taken after every repair. Every picture showed the boat exactly as I remembered. Nothing modernized, nothing replaced unnecessarily. Even Margaret's old brass bell remained mounted beside the bow. Then I noticed something impossible. 3 maintenance visits occurred after the official sail date. Yet every work order still required my handwritten navigation notes before repairs could begin. I never wrote them. Someone had copied them from somewhere. Driving home, one realization quietly settled into place. The boat had not merely been preserved. Someone had been following my own maintenance routines long after I believed the vessel had left my family forever. As I pulled into my driveway, an envelope rested inside my mailbox. No stamp, no return address. Inside lay one weathered page torn from an old navigation log. Across the bottom, Margaret had written only 6 words. "Some voyages require changing the captain. For the next several days, I behaved exactly the way Laura expected me to behave." I stopped mentioning the boat. I thanked her for Sunday dinner. I even joked that retirement gave a man too much time to miss things that no longer belonged to him. She smiled with visible relief, not because the mystery had disappeared, because she believed I had accepted the sale. During 31 years supervising Coast Guard search and rescue operations, I learned another lesson that repeatedly proved itself. The moment people believed you had stopped searching, they stopped hiding the shoreline. That became my strategy. On Tuesday morning, I quietly returned to the marina before sunrise. Daniel Brooks was already walking the docks inspecting mooring lines after an overnight tide.
"I figured I'd see you."
"I figured you'd expect me," he laughed softly. Laura was right about that. Instead of asking about the boat, I asked about the harbor itself. "How long have you managed this marina?" "Almost 20 years. "And Margaret?" His smile faded into something quieter. "Your wife knew every protected inlet better than most marine biologists." That surprised me. Margaret loved the coastline. She organized beach cleanups, collected nesting reports, photographed migrating birds. But she rarely talked about those weekends when she returned home. I assumed she simply enjoyed volunteering. Daniel unlocked the harbor records office. "You should probably see something." Not ownership records, not sales documents. He reached instead for a weathered wooden cabinet marked Historic Navigation Logs. Every heritage vessel that regularly sailed the protected bay kept voluntary navigation journals there. Daniel carefully removed one binder. Across the cover, Margaret had written in blue ink, "Margaret's Promise," the same words painted across my boat. Inside weren't fishing notes. They were shoreline observations. Water temperatures, marsh grass conditions, osprey nesting locations, manatee sightings, storm damage. Every entry ended the same way. Verified while underway aboard Margaret's Promise. The boat hadn't simply been used for fishing. It had quietly documented the harbor for years, technically complete, emotionally unfinished. I looked toward Daniel. "Why didn't Margaret tell me?" "I think she tried." Driving home, I realized my first conclusion had been wrong. The fishing boat wasn't the center of the mystery. The bay was. That afternoon, I visited the small maintenance shed, where I had stored spare anchors and emergency equipment for years. Frank Miller met me outside. "I found something while cleaning." He handed me a folded harbor permit tucked inside a waterproof chart envelope. The permit had expired almost 8 years earlier. Most of it looked ordinary. Vessel identification, slip assignment, seasonal registration. Then, one handwritten condition immediately caught my attention. Permit renewal contingent upon continued heritage navigation activity. Not boat ownership. Navigation activity. The wording echoed every maintenance invoice. Stewardship, heritage, navigation, different documents, the same language. As I turned the permit over, another note appeared in Margaret's handwriting. "If this permit ever matters, Peter will finally understand why we never skipped the autumn survey." I stood perfectly still. Every October, Margaret insisted we take one slow trip around the outer marshes before winter arrived. I believed we were simply enjoying retirement together. Now I wasn't sure we had ever been taking a pleasure trip at all. The fishing boat had quietly been doing a job I never recognized, and whatever that job truly was, someone still needed it to continue. I drove home with the expired harbor permit resting on the passenger seat beside me. Margaret's handwriting remained fixed in my mind. If this permit ever matters, Peter will finally understand why we never skipped the autumn survey. For years, I believed those October trips were simply our excuse to spend one more quiet afternoon on the water before winter settled over the bay. Now, every memory had begun changing shape. During 31 years supervising Coast Guard search and rescue operations, I learned another lesson that quietly guided every investigation. The most important mission often wasn't the one you thought you were assigned. It was the one you discovered halfway through. That evening I spread every document across my dining room table. The maintenance binder, the harbor permit, Margaret's navigation log, the anonymous page she left inside my mailbox. Each document repeated the same words: stewardship, heritage, navigation. None mentioned fishing. None mentioned recreation. Laura stopped by unexpectedly just before sunset. She noticed the papers immediately. "You've been busy." "I've been reading." She nodded toward the navigation log. "You found Mom's surveys." Not fishing notes, surveys. Another word she chose carefully.
I didn't know that's what they were.
"I know." For just a moment, she looked ready to explain everything. Instead, she quietly walked to the kitchen window, overlooking the harbor. "The council votes next Monday." "On what?" She hesitated, then answered only part of my question. "The future of the marina." Technically true, emotionally unfinished. Before leaving, she quietly placed a folded map beside the navigation log. No explanation, no instructions, only one sentence written across the top. "Compare the red markers with the autumn routes." After she left, I unfolded the chart. Red circles covered several marsh inlets surrounding the harbor. I compared them with Margaret's navigation logs. Every October route passed through those exact locations. Not randomly, precisely. Driving to the marina the following morning, I realized my investigation had changed direction again. I no longer wondered why the boat had been sold. I needed to know what Margaret had been documenting. Daniel Brooks was already waiting inside the harbor records office. Without speaking, I handed him the map. He studied it for several seconds. "You've reached the halfway point." "Halfway?" "Toward understanding." He unlocked another filing cabinet. Unlike the navigation logs, these folders contained harbor environmental permits dating back more than 20 years. Daniel carefully removed one blue folder. Across the cover appeared a title I had never seen before: Coastal Heritage Navigation Covenant. Not conservation program, not environmental survey. A covenant. Inside rested a signed agreement between the Harbor Authority, the State Coastal Commission, and several volunteer vessel owners. Margaret's signature appeared near the bottom. Mine did not. One clause immediately caught my attention. Protected shoreline status remains valid only while certified heritage vessels continue documented seasonal navigation through designated ecological corridors. I read the sentence twice, then a third time. The autumn trips, the navigation logs, the maintenance records, the preserved boat. Every clue suddenly pointed toward the same truth. Margaret's promise had never been preserving memories. It had quietly been preserving the harbor itself. Then Daniel pointed toward the final page. "The Redevelopment Council believes this covenant expired years ago." "Did it?" He slowly shook his head. "No. They simply haven't discovered the evidence proving it never stopped." For the first time since stepping aboard my supposedly sold fishing boat, I understood the real deadline. The mystery was no longer about my daughter. It was about whether decades of quiet stewardship would survive the harbor redevelopment vote, only 5 days away. 5 days remained before the harbor redevelopment vote. 5 days before decades of quiet stewardship would either survive or disappear beneath concrete docks and luxury condominiums. I drove home from the marina, carrying the Coastal Heritage Navigation Covenant inside the same weathered chart case Margaret had used for years. The agreement explained almost everything. Almost. One page was missing. Not torn away. Removed cleanly. The same careful precision I had already seen in other records. During 31 years supervising Coast Guard search and rescue operations, I learned another lesson that rarely failed. When only one page disappeared from a complete file, that missing page usually carried the only signature everyone still needed. I spread every document across my dining room table. Navigation logs, maintenance invoices, harbor permits, stewardship records, the anonymous note. Every piece fit together except the missing covenant page. Laura quietly knocked before letting herself inside. She noticed the documents immediately. "You found the covenant." "I found most of it." She lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For letting you believe I sold the boat because we couldn't afford it." Technically true, emotionally unfinished. "I thought you deserved more time." "Time for what?" She hesitated, then quietly answered only part of the question. To understand what Mom was really protecting. Before I could ask another question, she placed a folded envelope beside the navigation log. Across the front, Margaret had written, "Open only after Peter finds the covenant." Laura quietly left without waiting for me to read it. Inside rested one handwritten letter. "Peter, if you've reached this page, then you already know our fishing trips were never only about fishing. Every autumn survey kept the covenant alive for another year. But someday someone will try to convince the Harbor Council that the agreement quietly expired. Don't argue with them. Let them finish talking first. The missing page will matter only after they believe it doesn't exist." Strategic surrender. Margaret understood me better than anyone. That afternoon, I visited Daniel Brooks at the harbor office. "I think someone removed the covenant page intentionally." "I agree." "Who had access?" Daniel slowly opened a storage cabinet containing archived harbor correspondence. Instead of answering directly, he handed me another folder. Annual vessel inspection reports. Each inspection confirmed one identical statement. Certified Heritage Navigation successfully completed. Every year, without interruption, even after Laura supposedly sold the boat. Then Daniel quietly removed one final document from the bottom of the file, a certified maintenance affidavit. The boat had never left Protected Heritage Service, not for one season. Track A quietly became stronger, but Track B still lacked one missing piece. Driving home, I stopped at the Public Harbor Records building, hoping another archived copy of the covenant might exist. Instead, I found Richard Hale leaving the records office carrying a banker box filled with redevelopment files. He smiled politely. "Mr. Sullivan, I hear you've been studying old paperwork." "I've been reading." "So have I." He glanced briefly toward my chart case. "I'm afraid you're chasing history." "Sometimes history still has legal standing." He smiled again. "Only if someone can prove it." Technically true, emotionally revealing. As Richard drove away, I noticed one loose document sliding from the top of his banker box onto the parking lot. I picked it up after his car disappeared around the corner. It wasn't the missing covenant page. It was a council agenda. One item had been circled in red ink. Recommendation: declare Heritage Navigation Covenant permanently expired. The vote was now only 4 days away, and unless I found the missing page before then, everything Margaret quietly protected for nearly 2 decades could disappear with a single raised hand. I folded Margaret's letter and placed it inside the weathered navigation log, where she had always kept tide charts. The missing covenant page no longer felt like an accident. It felt deliberate. Someone wanted the Harbor Council to believe the Coastal Heritage Navigation Covenant had quietly expired. Someone also believed no one would ever reconnect every remaining document before the vote. During 31 years supervising Coast Guard search and rescue operations, I learned another lesson that mattered more than any rescue manual. A successful search never depended on finding one perfect clue. It depended on proving that every smaller clue described the same destination. The following morning, Daniel Brooks called before sunrise. "I think it's time." "For what?" "To open the last archive." Within the hour, I met him inside the old Harbor Administration building. Few people still used the basement records room. Steel cabinets lined the walls. Salt air drifted through the narrow windows, overlooking the marina. Daniel unlocked one cabinet I had never seen before. Across its faded label someone had written, "Certified Heritage Vessel Files, not redevelopment, not property transfers, heritage." Inside rested annual certification reports dating back nearly 25 years. Every inspection referenced the same vessel, Margaret's Promise. Every report confirmed continuous seasonal navigation. Every report cited Margaret's handwritten logs. Track A quietly became stronger. Then Daniel removed the final certification, issued only 8 months earlier. Long after Laura supposedly sold the boat, the certificate immediately caught my attention. Heritage status renewed through approved stewardship transfer. Transfer, not sale. The wording changed everything. Laura hadn't ended the covenant, she had preserved it. Daniel quietly nodded. That's why ownership stopped mattering. Another piece quietly settled into place. That afternoon I visited the Harbor Council offices. Richard Hale was already reviewing redevelopment presentations inside the conference room. He looked up as I entered.
"I wondered when you'd come."
"I've been reading."
"So have I."
He smiled confidently. "The council believes the covenant expired." "Does it?" "It will after Monday." Technically honest, emotionally revealing. I noticed one folder lying beside his presentation binder. Across the cover, someone had typed, "Evidence insufficient for continued heritage protection." Not evidence disproved, evidence insufficient. A meaningful difference. I thanked him for his time and quietly left without challenging a single statement. Strategic surrender had reached its most dangerous point. Driving back to the marina, I finally understood Margaret's instruction. Don't argue with them. Let them finish talking first. That evening, Daniel arrived carrying another waterproof document tube. I found this sealed inside the old chart locker. Inside rested the missing covenant page, not hidden, archived separately exactly as maritime regulations required. Across the bottom appeared every required signature. The State Coastal Commission, the Harbor Authority, Margaret Sullivan. Then one final endorsement completed 8 months earlier. Approved heritage stewardship transfer, Laura Sullivan. The documentary chain finally stood complete. Track A had become Track B. Maintenance invoices, navigation logs, harbor permits, heritage certifications, the covenant. Every document confirmed the next. Nothing depended upon memory anymore. Nothing depended upon belief. Then Daniel quietly handed me one final envelope. The council chairman asked me to give you this tomorrow morning. I looked at the seal. It remained unopened. I slipped it into my jacket without reading it. For the first time since my daughter supposedly sold my fishing boat, I willingly appeared defeated. Richard believed the redevelopment vote belonged to him. Laura believed I still needed one more day. Even Daniel wasn't entirely sure what I planned to do. Only Margaret had already known. Sometimes the safest way to protect a harbor was allowing everyone else to believe the tide had already turned. The Harbor Council chamber filled nearly an hour before the redevelopment vote began. Commercial developers occupied one side of the room. Local fishermen, conservation volunteers, and longtime marina families quietly gathered on the other. No one raised their voice. Everyone understood the decision waiting at the end of the morning would shape the shoreline for generations. I arrived carrying only one weathered chart case. Inside rested every document Margaret had quietly spent years preparing. During 31 years supervising Coast Guard search and rescue operations, I learned one final lesson that mattered more than every rescue I ever coordinated. Preparation only becomes visible when the emergency finally arrives. Richard Hale stood confidently beside a projection screen displaying architectural renderings of a completely rebuilt waterfront. Restaurants, luxury condominiums, expanded parking, new commercial docks, everything looked polished, everything looked permanent, until he reached the final slide. The Heritage Navigation Covenant expired years ago. No certified vessel continues the required seasonal documentation. Therefore, the redevelopment may legally proceed. Technically convincing, emotionally incomplete. The council chair looked toward the audience. Does anyone wish to respond? I quietly stood, not quickly, not dramatically, just calmly enough that every conversation stopped on its own. I do. Richard smiled politely. I assumed you might. He believed the missing covenant page remained lost. He believed the documentary chain could never be completed. I placed the chart case on the council table, then removed only one document. The annual heritage certification completed 8 months earlier. Margaret's promise remained continuously certified. Richard immediately shook his head. Certification alone doesn't preserve the covenant. Correct. I nodded. That's why it isn't my only document. One by one, I laid the evidence across the table. The maintenance records, navigation logs, harbor permits, seasonal inspection reports, stewardship transfer certificate, Every document connected naturally to the next. No speeches, only evidence. Richard attempted one final objection.
The covenant itself remains incomplete. Without the missing signature page, I quietly opened the final waterproof folder. The missing page rested exactly where maritime regulations required it to be archived. Every signature remained intact, including Laura's approved stewardship transfer completed 8 months earlier. The council chamber became completely silent. Richard stared at the document for several long seconds before speaking again. I wasn't aware that page existed. The council chair answered before I could. It existed. You simply never requested the certified archive. Technically true, emotionally decisive. Richard lowered his eyes. The confidence that had carried him through the entire presentation quietly disappeared. No confession followed. None was necessary. The documentary chain had already answered every important question. The council attorney carefully reviewed each document, then compared every certification date with the redevelopment filings. Finally, she closed the final folder. The Heritage Navigation Covenant never expired. The redevelopment recommendation relied upon an incomplete documentary review. She looked toward the council. The recommendation should be withdrawn. The motion passed unanimously. No applause followed, only quiet relief. Laura walked toward me after the meeting ended. I wanted to tell you. I know. I just couldn't risk breaking Mom's agreement. I smiled gently. You didn't. You kept it alive. Richard approached us before leaving. I owe both of you an apology. I believed the missing records meant the protection had ended. I nodded. You believed what the paperwork appeared to say. He quietly accepted responsibility for withdrawing every redevelopment filing based upon the incomplete record. Professional consequences would follow. The council announced an independent review of every archived waterfront agreement. Justice had begun. But something far more important than the vote still remained unfinished. For the first time since my daughter sold my fishing boat, I finally needed to understand why Margaret believed preserving a harbor mattered more than keeping the boat inside our own family. The morning after the Harbor Council protected the Coastal Heritage Navigation Covenant, I returned to the marina before sunrise. The water was almost perfectly still. For the first time in months, I wasn't searching for missing paperwork. I wasn't chasing unanswered questions. I was simply waiting. Daniel Brooks stood aboard Margaret's Promise, quietly coiling dock lines. When he saw me, he smiled. I think today's yours. He handed me the keys without another word, not ownership papers, just the keys. Sometimes that difference meant everything. Laura arrived carrying a weathered wooden box I had never seen before. I found this behind Mom's old chart cabinet. The brass latch still carried traces of salt from years on the water. Inside rested one folded chart, one faded photograph, and one final handwritten letter. The photograph showed Margaret standing at the bow of the boat beside a group of local children wearing oversized life jackets. Behind them stretched the same marsh channels we had surveyed every autumn. I had forgotten that day completely. Margaret never had. I unfolded the letter. My dear Peter, if you are reading this, then the harbor is still alive.
Our family is still together, and someone finally understands why I could never let this boat become only ours. I stopped reading for a moment. The morning tide gently rocked the boat beneath my feet. Then I continued.
You always believed Margaret's promise carried us safely across the bay. I always believed it carried responsibility. Every child who learned these waters, every nesting season we documented, every shoreline we protected, became part of our family, whether we knew their names or not. Laura quietly wiped away tears. I reached the final paragraph. That is why I asked you to let the boat leave our family before it could truly remain with us. Ownership ends someday. Stewardship can continue forever. Please don't try to bring the boat home. Help it keep finding people who need these waters as much as we once did. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt complete. Daniel quietly untied the final dock line. You should take her out. Not one last trip, just another one. Laura smiled. I think Mom would have liked that. We followed Margaret's old autumn route through the protected marshes. Osprey circled above the reeds. Herons lifted quietly from the shoreline. The same narrow channels Margaret carefully documented year after year remained untouched. Not because one family owned them, because many people had quietly protected them together. Several months later, the marina officially dedicated Margaret's Promise as a heritage education vessel. School children, volunteer naturalists, Coast Guard cadets, and local families used the boat throughout the year to learn safe navigation, coastal conservation, and the history of our harbor. The original brass nameplate remained exactly where Margaret had installed it decades earlier. Nothing about the boat felt lost. It had simply grown beyond us. Before leaving the dedication ceremony, Laura handed me one small polished wooden plaque. Not for the boat. For my workshop at home. Only 6 words had been engraved across its surface. Every safe harbor begins with stewardship. I hung it above my workbench that evening, not to remind myself what we had saved, but to remember why Margaret believed preserving something was never the same as possessing it. If this story reminded you that the greatest legacies are not the things we keep, but the responsibilities we pass forward, thank you for sharing this journey. May those you love leave you more than memories. May your kindness become someone else's safe harbor, and may every voyage you begin leave the shoreline stronger than you found it.